Alright guys, I'm hoping you're having a good day. Today, for the next few minutes, I want to talk to you guys about something called complex numbers. So when we think about numbers, there's lots of different types of numbers that we've talked about throughout your course in math. We've talked about something called the real number system. And when I talk about real numbers, it's basically any number that you know right now. Okay? And when we look at the real numbers, they were breaking down into something called rational and irrational. Well, when I look at real numbers, rational numbers, and irrational numbers, it's part of a bigger picture of types of numbers. And that is called the complex number system. Okay? So what I want to talk about is what are complex numbers. And in order to do that, I know that a complex number is something that contains a real number and something else called an imaginary number. So let's talk about the idea of imaginary number. So when I think about this, let's look at number one. I'm going to solve this equation. And I want to get m squared by itself because we want to solve this by square root. So I'm going to subtract 8 from both sides. So when I do that, I get 2m squared to equal negative 2. Now I'm going to do all the right math. And I'm going to divide both sides by 2. And I end up with m squared equaling negative 1. But here's what I'm going to do. Is I want to solve this. And I'm going to take the square root of both sides. Okay? Well, I'm going to put it into my trusty calculator and see what happens. So what I'm going to do is I am going to take the square root of negative 1. And when I do that, it tells me my solution is non-real. It's a non-real answer. Okay? So how am I going to solve that? Well, what happened is mathematicians found this to be true. They found it to be true, and what they did was they created a different type of number. And what this allows me to do is say that when I run into a problem of this, x squared equals negative 1, and when I square root both sides, what I'm saying is I will get square root of negative 1. Well, what they're saying is that whenever I take the square root of negative 1, that is the same thing as I. Whenever I think about I think about the square root of negative 1. So basically what a complex number is it's a real number combined with an imaginary number, or an imaginary number without a real number. Okay? So the big idea here is that when I think about taking the square root of negative 1, I am thinking of an imaginary number which is a part of the complex number system. So let's go back to this question here. I'm still trying to find out what the square root of negative 1 is. So all I'm going to say is that m is the same thing as plus or minus I. So to take the square root of negative 1, I am replacing it with an I because I is the same thing as the square root of negative 1. So it's plus or minus I. So let's look at another example. I'm going to solve this one same way. I'm going to subtract 7 from both sides. So I'm going to get 9x squared equals negative 81. I'm going to divide both sides by 9. And I get x squared equals negative 9. I'm going to take the square root of both sides. And I'm going to get x to be square root of negative 9. Now, I'm going to take out an I because there's a negative 1 there. So it's the same thing as I square root of 9, plus or minus I square root of 9. Well, I know what the square root of 9 is. So I'm going to say it's plus or minus 3i, and I'm done. So all I'm doing is, in order to get rid of my negative, I'm just putting an I in front of the square root of 9. That gets rid of the negative located right there. Now these are numbers, so I can do lots of things with numbers. And what I want to try, first off, before I get into the new thing, what I want you guys to do is I want you guys to try questions 3 and 4, and we're going to talk about them on Monday. Now, let's look at this. I can add them and I can subtract them. It's like any other number. I can add them, I can subtract them, and I can actually also multiply them. So I want to add and subtract these two quantities. Well, all I'm thinking about is when I'm adding and subtracting is just think about, hey, I'm combining like terms when I'm adding and subtracting. Okay? So I'm looking at this. I have 3 minus negative 1. So I'm going to take 3 minus negative 1 and find out what that is. Then I'm going to take I, and I'm going to subtract positive 2i. I minus positive 2i. So 3 minus negative 1 is positive 4. And then I'm going to take 1i minus 2i, which I get minus 1i. So I get 4 minus 1i as my final answer. Now let's look at this next one. I'm adding negative 3 and positive 3 together. I'm combining those two terms together. And then I'm taking 8i and I'm adding 5i to it. So negative 3 plus 3 is 0. 8i plus 5i is 13i. So it's basically 13i is my final answer. So when I'm thinking about adding and subtracting, all I'm thinking about is combining like terms. So with that said, I want you guys to try 7 and 8, and we'll talk about them on Monday. Now let's talk about multiplication. I'm going to think about this the way that we did it before. So we talked about multiplication of binomials before, and we made a box. I'm going to do the same thing here because I have binomial, which is two terms being multiplied times together. So I'm going to take negative 3 minus 1i on the top, and then I'm going to take 8 minus 8i on the side. And I'm just going to multiply these two terms together. So 8 times negative 3 is negative 24. 8 times negative 1i is negative 8i. Negative 8i times negative 3 is positive 24i. And then negative 8i times negative 1 is 8i squared. So you guys remember, one of the great things about doing the box method with multiplication is my like terms are right next to each other. So I have negative 24 plus 16i plus 8i squared. Okay? Well, now I have something, I've seen this before, but I've never seen anything like that before. So how do I deal with that? Well, remember, I said that I is the same thing as the square root of negative 1. Well, what does that mean about I squared? Well, if I were to square both sides, I squared is the same thing as negative 1. Okay, so I just got rid of the square root by squaring both sides. So whenever I see I squared, what I can do is replace the I with negative 1. So what I end up with is negative 24 plus 16i plus negative 8. Now I can clean it up, add those two terms together because they're like each other. I get negative 32 plus 16i. Okay? Let me just do one more with you guys and then I'll let you go. So let's look at this one. Same idea. Make a box, multiplying these two together. I have 3 minus 5i on the top, 5 minus 2i on the side. 5 times 3 is 15. 5 times negative 5 is negative 25i. Negative 2i times 3 is negative 6i. Negative 2 times negative 5 is positive 10i squared. These two terms are like each other, so I got 15 minus 31i plus 10i squared. Remember, we said I squared is the same thing as negative 1. So I got 10 times negative 1, which is negative 10. So I have 15 minus 31i plus 10 times negative 1, or 15 minus 31i minus 10. 15 minus 10 is 5 minus 31i. Okay? Hopefully this helps. I want you guys to try the next two questions, 11 and 12, and we'll talk about it on Monday. Hopefully you guys have a good weekend. Bye.